Hi everyone, I am Gilly Mendes Ferreira. I'm the Head of Education Policy and Research with the Scottish SPCA. I am going to very briefly talk to you about the impact of COVID-19 that we have seen when it comes to relationships between humans and animals in Scotland. Very briefly, the Scottish SPCA is a national organisation. In Scotland, we have been supporting animals for over 180 years. We have a number of animal rescue and rehoming centres throughout the country, as well as a dedicated wildlife rescue centre. We will help any species that comes into Scotland and needs it. It costs around £44,000 per day to run the Scottish SPCA, and our animal helpline is open every day of the year. So I want you to think very briefly about good examples of positive relationships between humans and animals. Certainly, you see lots of examples, no matter how old or young you are. When you see how children interact with animals, often children will see animals as their best friend, someone that they can confide in. Animals are a great way of actually helping families interact with each other and creating bonds between each other. And certainly as you get a lot older and maybe life isn't as hectic, animals can be great at ensuring that you don't feel lonely or isolated, but still actually getting you outdoors and getting you to meet new people. But we know that there's lots of examples where sadly a relationship between a human and animal can become damaged, and that might be due to domestic abuse, it might be financial reasons, relationship breakdowns, impact of things like alcohol and drugs, and of course COVID-19, which is what we're talking about today. So as I said, our animal helpline is open every day of the year. The calls that come in tend to be quite seasonal, so they do fluctuate throughout the year. Generally, our summer months are our busiest months, and we get a lot of calls related to wildlife, and the winter tends to be a little bit quieter. Interestingly though, since sort of June 2021, we've actually received the highest number of calls compared with the last 2 years, and that's very much linked to Scotland actually coming out of another lockdown and restrictions easing. People will call our animal helpline for lots of different reasons. Again, we've actually seen the biggest increase in calls when it's related to donations. We have done some campaigns to try and raise funds. That's been a positive response. People looking to rehome animals from us, but also sadly people looking to rehome animals to us or relinquishing their animals because they're not in a position to take care of them anymore. We've also had calls relating to people concerned about vets fees and how they're going to actually afford them. There's been a noticeable increase in calls relating to disputes, particularly when it comes to dog barking. So that could be again linked to people initially home working, they go out and purchase the dogs, then some people have actually started returning to work, leaving their dog at home for periods of time. That dog has maybe never actually had that time in the house on its own. So obviously a bit of separation anxiety and is barking away. Generally, we wouldn't go out to dog barking complaints unless there was a welfare concern. That's normally done by our local authorities. When we go out to an instance, that could be something that we are investigating, or we're going out to actually help rescue an animal. Again, this seems to be really high levels in June this year. As I said, this is when restrictions were easing, and particularly when it came to travel. So people were actually allowed to travel further afield in Scotland from June. At the moment, this year is actually proving to be far busier compared to the previous years. We also started sort of categorizing some of the calls when it came to whether people had COVID or not, whether they were self-isolating. We saw a peak in July last year where there were quite a lot of high-risk calls. These are actually people who did have COVID, and they had concerns that maybe they didn't have a support network in place and they needed food, for example, for their dogs. So we helped deliver that service. And maybe they were worried about the animal not getting exercise. So again, we tried to help and support and put them in touch with different organisations who could maybe help them do that. I mentioned that certainly summer months tend to be very busy for us, particularly when it comes to wildlife. We get a lot of calls anyway when it comes to particularly gulls and also fledglings, so young birds that have left the nest but can't quite fly properly yet. When lockdown ended in June 2020, we saw the number of calls related to birds dramatically increase, and this year has been again exceptionally busy. We know that when people were in lockdown, everyone took advantage of having that daily exercise. So people explored new places that were on their doorsteps, and that change of behaviour seems to have continued. And certainly people are exploring outdoors a lot more, and that's possibly why we are seeing this increased calls when it comes to wildlife. We don't tend to get too many calls when it comes to farm animals, but certainly on domestic animals. In 2020, the number of dogs and cats involved in an incident was actually lower than 2019. However, in 2021, the number of incidents seems to be increasing back to pre-pandemic levels. Again, this might be the knock-on effect of people actually purchasing pets during the pandemic, and they're now having more issues now that restrictions have eased. When you look at why animals have come into our centres, in 2019, the main reason was stray animals. These are all yellow dots. But 2020, 2021, this seems to have changed, where we actually got a lot more welfare animals coming in. Welfare animals are people who've maybe called us and they've actually signed the animal over to us because they can't take care of its welfare properly. We've also had quite a few temporary refuge animals. So these are the purple dots. And temporary refuge are animals that we have seized using the legislation that's available in Scotland. And normally have seized those animals because of poor welfare. And then it's up to the courts to decide whether the animal will go back to the owner or whether they get signed over into the Scottish SPCA's care. In July this year, we have actually started to see more strays now come through. And again, the concern is, are these animals that have been purchased during the pandemic, and then people are trying to return to sort of normality, and they don't have the time for those animals anymore. We did have to change how we rehomed animals. So during the pandemic, obviously we couldn't have people come to our centre, so we had to adopt virtual rehoming. And actually we're now in a position where we're kind of doing a mixture of both, where people will start the process looking at virtual, and then they'll hopefully come out and have a meeting outdoors with the animal that they are looking to rehome. One of the biggest problems we've had is a lot of our centres are still full of temporary refuge animals. These are animals that cannot be rehomed because you're waiting for the court's decision. That means we've not had as much space for other animals coming into our care, and we've had to rely on partners such as Dogs Trust to support that because we are at capacity at the moment. The puppy trade has also not helped the types of jobs that we've been dealing with. So since the beginning of the year, we've received over 8,200 reports regarding sick puppies from low welfare breeders, and that's actually up 7.6% on the first half of 2020. We have a dedicated special investigations unit that looks into badger baiting and dog fighting and the puppy trade, and they've actually opened 355 cases regarding low welfare pups so far this year, and that's triple the number at the same time in 2020. We know that demand for puppies have been extremely high. We know that the price has actually soared when you look at the online adverts. And unfortunately, this demand is driven to those dealers and breeders who don't have welfare as their primary interest, actually transporting pups, particularly from Ireland, across into Scotland, selling them, and members of the public are ending up with pups that carry disease, some that actually sadly only last a few days and then they pass away. So this has been a big public campaign that we're continually trying to fight just now. Very briefly, our Animal Guardians programme. This is a programme that works with young people who get referred to us because they're showing behaviours towards animals that are a cause of concern. As you will see across the 3 years, the most common sort of species tends to be domestic animals, but we have seen an increase again relating to wildlife this year. When you look at why young people have been referred, generally it's because they physically harmed an animal, but again we've seen a shift, and this year sadly 30% of the referrals so far relate to animals actually having been killed. When you look at the sex of a child or young person, generally it tends to be more males that are referred than females. This year it seems to be slightly closer, and it'll be interesting to see where we end up at the end of the year. And when we look at the age of referrals, what's been really interesting is in 2019, we saw that it was quite a broad age range, whereas in 2020 and 2021, there's definitely been a lot more younger referrals, and sadly we're getting referrals now as young as 3 years old. I briefly wanted to mention a study that's actually just been completed by the University of Edinburgh. This was a partnership project with ourselves and Blue Cross. And what we're trying to really look at and understand is what support do people actually need with their pets in Scotland? What can we provide to make things easier? This study is currently getting written up into various papers for publication, but some of the key findings were that men are reporting greater challenges with their pets than women. Those with lower resources, so that can be indicated through the employment status, housing measures, benefits and use of food banks, are most likely to experience challenges. What was also interesting was that only a small proportion of people had considered giving up their pet as a result of these challenges, and the majority felt their pet, dogs especially, had helped them during the pandemic. So that at least that's a reassuring finding that's coming out. Please go on, and there's a web link there, and have a look at lots of different projects. We do work very closely with the University of Edinburgh, and we will always put latest results on that web link, so please check it out. So in conclusion, our ability to rehome animals was definitely impacted by the pandemic. We tried a virtual rehoming model, and we're now doing a sort of blended approach just now. Certainly instances involving dogs, cats and wildlife is increasing since lockdown ended. The delays in the court system due to the pandemic has had a knock-on effect on the number of animals in our care, resulting in major capacity issues. There is new legislation coming in at the end of this month, which will help alleviate this. We have seen an increase in animal guardians referrals with regards to negative interactions with wildlife. We've also seen an increase in referrals of younger aged children, some as young as 3 years old. And sadly, we've also seen an increase in referrals this year of instances where an animal has been killed by a child or young person. There's lots of things that we are trying to do to make a difference. We have an amazing Animal Wise prevention program that educates everyone of all generations. And that might be running adventure clubs outdoors. It might be delivering e-learning courses, virtual sessions, face-to-face workshops. So please go again, Google Animal Wise, and you can see everything that we are offering. The Scottish SPCA is certainly developing its own kind of expansion of the One Welfare. So we're very much embracing One Welfare and sustainable development goals, but we're also bringing in the different stages of development, human stroke animal, and looking at the impacts, both positive and negative, that can have, and then sourcing those partners who can help us work together to bridge that gap between humans and animals. Working together is definitely key. Here are just some of the partners that we work with. As you will see, again, lots of other animal welfare organisations, universities. That's very important that we do continually measure the impact that we are having with our different activities, and also a lot of human charities as well. And again, this is where it's getting that recognition that something happens to an animal, there's normally a human the other side of that, possibly that human also needs support. And together, our role, certainly at Scottish SPCA, is to support the animal welfare side, but we need to make sure that we found the right partner to help the human side as well, so that together we can actually truly make a difference. So I want to say a huge thank you for listening. You've got my email address there. I'm also on Twitter. I think so far, One Welfare Conference, amazing lineup. Really looking forward to the presentations today as well. So thank you, One Welfare, and speak to you soon.